Hey, you guys, welcome back to the Forming Women podcast. I'm Jeff. This is Alyssa. And as you can tell, and as I mentioned last week, unless you're just tuning in, this is the Forming Women podcast. So I'm just here to be a host. I'm just here to interview my beautiful...
I'm going to make you say it every time.
Yeah, you know.
Welcome to the Forming Women podcast.
I feel insecure. I say it. Hey, welcome to the Forming Women podcast. But I am the host, so I am the one that has to say it because I'm here just to interview and extrapolate and extract and absorb from my beautiful, incredible, smart, awesome wife, Alyssa, all the wisdom you've been sitting on.
And then you add in all this research and just
I'll add in some nuggets, you know.
Like a Malcolm Gladwell.
I'll try. You know, it's fun. So as we mentioned in week 1, go back and listen to that, by the way, if you haven't, because I think that really set up the whole season of the tone and the spirit in which we're trying to do this first season. But as we talked about, we kind of did a little TBD or TBC, to be continued.
Is that a real term?
TBD is to be determined. TBC, I don't think is a real term.
I've never heard
but
that.
To be continued is a real term. So I kind of like morphed the TBD acronym. There you go. So is kind of continuation of what we talked about in episode 1. So I do feel like we left off with more to say now that we've thought about it on earning our heart and control specifically and kind of managing outcomes and all that. So let's talk about that for a few more minutes. And then I really spend most of our time on, okay, so then what does it mean to not do that? How do we not do that? And then maybe losing heart, stuff like that.
When we lose heart,
Exactly. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to keep talking about this idea of control because I love what you said about, what did you say? There's something you said. I was like, I want to keep talking about that. I think learning to live a life of surrender.
About Jesus. I said either the Jesus stuff of like Jesus is the perfect person that didn't manage outcomes and still got killed even though he was perfect, or the last 3% thing with Rollheiser.
Yes,
and like
the last 3%.
You have to surrender those last. That's what takes you good to great. The story of the lawyer, all that stuff.
Thank you. Okay, which I wanted to go back to Ronald Rollheiser. So we're reading Sacred Fire right now, which is fire, literally.
Yeah,
so
great
if you
book.
want to,
one of my favorite
if you want to study more of what we're talking about, just read that whole book and read it 10 times. You'll love it. But one of the things that really stood out to both of us when we were reading it was in the book, he talks about essential discipleship and then mature discipleship. And so, and he kind of gives this framework of walking with the Lord. And he says, the first part of our walk with the Lord is a lot of it is spent fighting with the devil. Of like fighting temptations, fighting lust, fighting just more like outwardly sins and temptations. And then we move into more mature discipleship is where we fight with God. And it's more like, Lord, can I really trust you with this? Are you really good with this? Are you really good? Can I really surrender and live a life of sacrifice, trusting that you are trustworthy? And I think when I read that, it was like a light bulb went off of like, this makes so much sense. And I think now that we're like mid-30s and a little older, I feel like we're entering into the mature discipleship part where I wish I had had that language 3 years ago or even last year because I think a lot of us, it can feel really scary of, I'm fighting with the Lord. Like I'm fighting to trust him because we grew up thinking like, of course he's trustworthy. Of course his Bible is true. And then we enter this thing like, Lord, are you really good? And it can make our faith feel a little bit shaky. And I think a lot of us, as we enter into the 30s who grew up in the church, we hit a lot of disillusionment because our life is not looking like we thought it would be. Our expectations are not what we thought. We thought we would, whatever it may be. You thought you may be married by now. You thought you may have children. You thought your kids would be different kids or your marriage would be in a certain way, and these life experiences happen and our life is not what we thought it would be. And so how do we walk with God through those instead of just kind of becoming dead and not going there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that framework is so helpful, and it's just a really succinct way to think about your own heart and your own life if you're listening. Is that, to jumping from essential discipleship to mature discipleship is going from, as Rollheiser says, from fighting the devil for the first half of your life, from fighting God for the second half of your life. And maybe you could even use the word wrestle. But what he means by that is, the essential discipleship is getting rid of kind of your blatant sins. And there's even another spiritual formation kind of directory who has 4 levels of kind of spiritual formation. And the top 2 are kind of above the surface and the bottom 2 are below the surface. And it's like levels of maturity. And he's like, most Christians will go to their deathbed only doing level 1 and level 2 of maturity and discipleship. But it's similar of like, stop looking at porn, get your life in order, stop doing these bad things, maybe get, the greed or the lust out of your heart in a significant way. And of course, some of that stuff doesn't leave forever, completely, perfectly, but just kind of like you kind of like have resisted the devil, you've started to follow the Lord, you've renounced a certain amount of things, and your life is showing fruit of that. That's essential discipleship. Some of us only stay there. Mature discipleship is that invitation to a kind of a weirder, more disorienting place, which is then fighting with the Lord, and that would be something akin to more like Jacob wrestling with God and getting the limp, and because of the injury in his hip, and where the angel touched him. And so I think that is the invitation, if you're 35 plus, that, or maybe younger, is have you surrendered to that? And some people will wrestle with the Lord for the next 50 years before they surrender. Like that's a real genuine surrender that means a lot of things, looks like a lot of different things. And so I think that's really, really critical, is because what can happen is you can get to a place of complacency in your life. This is almost exactly like the story I talked about last week with the lawyer of like, I've done all these things, I'm pretty good. But here's the genuine smoke signal on if you've entered into mature discipleship in a good way or fought with the Lord in a good way. And that's with the same story of the lawyer, that he didn't. And it says, what did it say at the end again? He walked away with deep sadness. So of course there's a level of sadness we all have in our entire life because of life, circumstances, whatever. But there's a level of deep sadness that we just know in our heart when we're like quiet, that like, man, I'm not all that I can be. I haven't given it all to the Lord. I'm not my full realized self in surrender to him and following him. And that does create a deep sadness. And so that's a really interesting like signal to yourself of that your frustration with that has to be greater than the sadness of complacency and the sadness of just staying in it, because the Lord does invite us into something really special and something really, really deep on usually the second half of our life, or that second kind of jump into mature discipleship. Yeah.
I love that you brought up the story of Jacob, because I've said this a lot lately I used to hate that story.
Yeah.
And if you're not familiar, there's a story in Genesis where Jacob wrestles with the angel of the Lord, which can be Jesus. I guess that's a theological debate. Yeah. But all through the night, and then in the morning, he has a limp, and he's like surrendered to the Lord. Yeah. And I was like, Lord, I don't get that. Why is that in the Bible? Why is he fighting with you? How dare he fight with you? Like, you are the Lord God Almighty. When I read that story.
Great job defending the Lord right there. He really needed that. He really needed that.
That's just,
how dare he's the Lord God Almighty.
But like, I think sometimes that's how I'm like, how dare we wrestle with God? Totally. Shouldn't we just accept everything and say yes? Like, yes, sir, Yeah. And really now I read that and I'm like, Lord, thank you that you are the God that invites us to wrestle. Yeah. But I think the key here is that, one, he wrestled with God. I think a lot of times we can choose to wrestle and fight, but we don't do it with God. Yep. And we don't do it for the purpose of closeness with God. We do it just so like, I'm just closing off my heart to you, God.
Yeah, or find answers or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that he wrestled with God, and he did it through the night, which I'm like, that is such a metaphor of you wrestle with the Lord through the darkness of your soul until morning comes. Keep wrestling, keep asking, keep seeking, keep on your knees. Whatever that wrestle may be, maybe it's a deep grief you have, maybe it's a disillusionment, a deep disappointment, but that in the morning he will meet you, and you may come away with a limp, but you will come away knowing that you wrestled with him until you see the goodness of God.
I don't think may come away with a limp. I think a limp is actually the sign that you did it. Something will be, because I also think that's part of the second half of life is the disillusion. You come to this realization that, and I think Jesus even had a level of this kind of like, that just life is difficult. You get the kind of the rose-colored glasses taken from you in a good way. There's a way that can go too dark, in a way that can go like it takes away, you become an Eeyore and everything's like you have full joy, full heart, full love, full like bright eyes for the kingdom and childlike faith and all these things. But there is something about that middle chapter of life that like you become content and resigned to the fact that not everything will go how you want it. Yeah. And you're like, you're at peace with that. Yep. You've like kind of become at peace with that. And that really the goal then becomes not because that's an outcome-based thing of that life will go exactly how I've wanted. Yep. If I do these exactly.
things.
And if you finally come to peace with that, then there will be a sign of that limp and a sign of that sadness somewhere in your life. But then there's joy on the other side of it, of that, man, this, but following Jesus is the most important. Becoming like him is the most important. Having my face glow like Moses's did on the hill is the most important. Having intimacy with the Lord is the most important. Like all, and not the outcomes. No matter what may come my way and what may befall our situation. I think that's the most important for sure.
Yeah, so good. I think our counselor once told me, he's like, I think so many of us live to survive. We just want the answer. We want to survive, when really we are being invited into living for relationship with deep intimacy with the Lord. But we have to realize that there's more to survival. And I think survival is wanting the answer. It's wanting our life to look a certain way, that you will be okay. When really God is saying, no, I want to have this deep connection with you, that no matter what happens in your life, no matter what the outcome is, we are okay because you are deeply connected with me. And he said it's kind of like, and I told him, I was like, but I really just want the answer. He's like, I know, because we really want survival. Yeah. And he gave this beautiful picture of a really, like, think of like a really big oak tree. And he said, the oak tree at the top may have leaves that are swaying in the wind with the circumstances of life. It may feel crazy. You may be going back and forth. But the root and the trunk of the tree is not moving at all, because it is sturdy and deeply planted in the soil. And so the goal of life is to have the sturdiness of soul, no matter what the circumstances of life may be. And it just is such a beautiful invitation that we don't have to fear the outcome, or we don't have to fear our life not being what we thought it would be. But actually, when our expectations are unmet, we actually can meet with God and seek him and wrestle with him until we see his goodness and create this deep, girded sturdiness of soul.
Totally. And we've already kind of crept into part 3, so we can keep going with this some more. So it's first part is a lot of people neglect their heart. Yeah. Second part is a lot of people try to earn their heart. Third part, which is the final one before the kind of the solution and invitation God asks us into, is losing heart. And I think that's also a very, very detrimental thing to a lot of people. So what does it mean to lose your heart, and kind of what are some signs of that? What are the consequences of that?
Yeah, I think I wrote in the book how I had this cohort of women that I led for a while, and I had my seminary professor come and do a Zoom call with us, and he's in his 70s, and he is one of my favorite people of all time. Jeff knows he was in his classes.
But I dropped out. Shut up. I love him, but school's not for me.
Gary Brashears. And, at the time when I signed up for seminary, he had just got diagnosed with 3 different cancers. And for the first semester, he would literally teach with his eyelids taped to his eyebrows because he couldn't keep his eyes open with the medication he was taking. And he still was so full of joy, so thankful to be there, still teaching us. He's just one of my favorite people that I've ever met. And so I had him guest speak on our Zoom call. And one of the ladies in my group who's gone through so much suffering in her home, and especially during this time, she said, and I kind of had asked him, I was like, Gary, can you just tell us, how do we remain faithful? How do we live life and the walk with the Lord by not getting like off course and not finishing the race? How do we stay faithful even when life is really hard? And so he gave a great talk. And so then my friend asked, Gary, how do I not lose heart? And he immediately said, sometimes you will lose heart, but you lose heart with the Lord so that he will then give you heart. And I think that is such a beautiful, it breathes so much grace and life to me, because I think sometimes I felt like there's been so many times where I've lost heart. There's been so many circumstances in my life where it feels so desperate. It feels like I have hoped and I've hoped and I've prayed and I've asked the Lord and I've asked mentors and I'm fighting so hard and the thing is not changing and my heart is completely like shattered, just broken, and I don't see how you're going to make a way through, God. And I think sometimes, that there's a psalm about like, man, not lose heart or something like that. And I just thought like I almost had this idea that it was a sin to lose heart. And him saying that was like, okay, this is human. It's human that life sometimes will be so hard that we will lose heart. But when we when we give that to the Lord and we lay that brokenness before him, he will then give us heart to continue to walk through that with strength.
Yes.
And that is through, it's through so much. I think a huge thing that we don't talk about in the church is lament.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we don't even have language for that. We don't know how to deal with grief. And the reality is, the Psalms are like one of my favorite books of the Bible. But for so long, I would only go to the Psalms that were really happy and ended with a bow, so to speak, like a pretty bow at the end. Like, Lord, I trust you. I know that I will see your goodness in the land of the living. But so many of the Psalms actually are laments where the psalmist is crying out to God with completely gut honest prayers. And some of them end with a pretty bow of like Selah, like they wait and you don't know how long the wait is. And then they preach truth to themselves like, no, Lord, I know that I can trust you. And some do not end with a pretty bow. But knowing that the walk of life, we can lament over the griefs that happen, over the disappointments and the way that our life isn't turning out. And that actually, when we lament, that's how we work through our griefs. But if we never do that, then we kind of just stay stuck in our griefs.
Yeah. And while you were talking, I was looking on my phone because that phrase I realized is all over the scriptures. And just quickly, I found, 8 verses or something, 7 verses that say that specific phrase, do not lose heart. Jesus says it in Luke 18, Paul says it in 2 Corinthians 4, Galatians 6, Ephesians 3, Hebrews 12, 2 Thessalonians 3, and then back to the Old Testament, 1 Samuel 17 says not to lose heart as well. So I find that such a perfect phrase for it's an admonition that we need, an encouragement that we need when we're about to lose heart. But even the Luke 18 one I find is so encouraging to me because that's Jesus seeing the future that's coming for them. Like the cross is coming, that's going to be brutal for them. Even beyond that, them not know, when they have to wait for the Holy Spirit and Pentecost, there's just a lot of fear and they don't know what's going on. But he's saying do not lose heart for I am with you. And I think that is the most encouraging thing is that in those moments, when you can feel like you want to lose heart is when you have to remind yourself that the God of the universe is not far and distant, but he's close. And that closeness is what allows you to be kind of undergirded and kept up, almost like Moses' arms were lifted up and kept up by the angel. And so I think that is really, really important to remember that that humans have been tempted to lose heart forever.
Yeah.
And that God specifically speaks to not losing heart. And so wherever
take courage.
Exactly, to take courage. So wherever you're listening, wherever you're, if you're in the gym, if you're in the car, wherever you're at right now listening, just be encouraged that, God does not want you to lose heart, that there is a path through. No matter how dark it looks, no matter how bad it feels, there is always a path through. And it can be, by the way, through some type of metaphorical death. So it will be painful. It will be hard. Resurrection can only happen if death has happened first.
Yeah.
And a seed can only grow and sprout and give fruit to people once it's actually buried in pure darkness in the ground. And so all these things are true. But resurrection is on the other side. Death doesn't have the last word. It's actually, death isn't the final word. Death is actually just a channel and a conduit through to resurrection if you are following Jesus, surrendering yourself to him because he holds the keys to the power of resurrection. So I don't know if you'd say anything else there for the last one, or a final thought, a final practice, a final note, anything to wrap up episode 1 and 2?
Yeah, I think I was just wanting to add to, as we think about our disappointments and our griefs and lament, that's one way to work through our griefs. But I think a huge other aspect is doing it with community, that we are not made to be alone, to do life alone, to do faith alone. And I think even in the topic of formation, I think so much it can be like, oh, that's for me. I need to be formed. I need to grow. Yeah. But it's not just so you can be amazing. It's so that you can help bring the kingdom and the city of God, so that you can be a blessing to others. And I think not only is our formation for the blessing of others, but also our formation has to be with other people. It has to be with community. And so I think, a huge thing that I've learned with friendships is, especially in women friendships, is to have friendships where you can talk about what you're hoping for and what you're grieving. If it's going to coffee, if it's a retreat, if it's a Bible study, to just always be talking of what are you hopeful for and what are you grieving, and to go there with people. And then when the griefs come, to walk that out with each other. So sometimes that can look so different. It's crying with each other. It's praying with each other. It's walking through the grief with someone, but you have to be honest about it. You have to be honest with yourself. You have to be honest with other people. But inviting other people to grieve with you will give strength to your soul.
Yeah.
It will give you the courage you need so you don't lose heart. We have to have other people to hold us up. I think of Moses when he was holding up his hands in the battle, and every time that his hands were lowered, the Israelites would lose. And every time that can you imagine holding up your hands? I don't even know how many hours that was. I can't even do 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And so his friends held up his hands. And I think of that, especially when we're going through seasons of feeling like we're losing hearts. You have to surround yourself with, your people, at least one person or two people to hold up your hands to walk through that.
Yeah. And I think a final note too, I would say to those listening is that's the fun part about that question of constantly asking, what are you hoping for? And what's something difficult right now or something like that is it shows the complexity of life operates that way. And I ask a very similar question, like literally anytime I'm with someone that's like at a coffee, I asked a buddy of it yesterday golfing, what's something fun? What's something hard? So it's a similar version of the same question. And what's interesting is no one never there's always an answer to both.
Unless if you're just not self-aware.
Yeah, no. I mean, I've never ran into it like that. Meaning, like you're always holding the complexities of and that's I think a part of maturity of life too. Is the more you grow, life just is not all hard and it's not all good.
Yeah.
Like someone, it's just this weird blend sometimes that can be really difficult of really serious stuff. Someone passes away and there's enormous grief and lament over here, but then there's a birth of a new baby over here, and there's joy. Like it's a wild spectrum and complexity of life. But I think that constantly reminding yourself of that just like kind of awakens the senses and just kind of keeps you hopeful when grief is knocking at the door. And then also keeps you really empathetic and sensitive when there's a lot of joy as well to other people and to hard and difficulties as well. So
it so fits, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep.
Exactly. So I hope this was a fun kind of wrap up to part 1 and part 2. We're excited to talk about the next part of the framework in the next episode, and we'll see you then.